so I just pressed got it. Sheffield, we moved there when I was 13, lived in mill houses, and then we moved down to Ecclesall, near the Botanical Gardens. So lived there till, university, and then went off to Coventry for 3 years.
So Ian, are we live, ready to go? We are. Well, good afternoon, everybody, or if you're in England, as is our author, Robert Lloyd. Good evening. So we are here to talk today about The Poison Machine, which is the sequel to The Bloodless Boy. We are also here to talk to the other child brother, because last year when The Bloodless Boy came out, Lee Child and Robert and I discussed it. And in fact, on this new book, on my advanced reading copy, Lee is still quoted as saying, an impeccable historical mystery, superb. So Andrew Child has kindly agreed to join us today and talk to Robert about his book. So I think there's a lot of UK brother bonding going on. Would that be fair, Andrew?
I think it would. So Barbara, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today. It's lovely to have Rob join us, because what a treat it has been to read these last two books. So I assume that everybody watching today has already bought The Bloodless Boy and has pre-ordered The Poison Machine. If you haven't, then do so immediately from the Poison Pan, because these are books that you do not want to miss. I remember how excited Lee actually found the book first last year, and I remember we were talking about, we always talk about what we're reading, what we have enjoyed, what we're looking forward to. I remember how enthusiastic he was, and that's what drew me into to reading Rob's books. So obviously the first thing that jumps out is that you write historical. Now, reading your books, if you look at the language that you use, you look at the intrigue, you look at the plotting, you look at the mystery, you could pretty much write in any time period. So what is it about historical fiction that made you choose to set your books in the past?
And I guess the main reason, Andrew, is that I did an MA in the history of ideas and discovered Robert Hooke and ended up writing my MA thesis about Robert Hooke. So I already had that research to fall back on when I decided that I was going to write a thriller. It's so long ago now. I thought, right, I'm going to write a thriller as a kind of intellectual exercise, I suppose. And what a foolish thing that was to do. I thought that would be quite a straightforward thing. So I read a lot of thrillers. I analysed Frederick Forsyth's The Odessa File to see how it's done, and decided that it was going to be a thriller, but I had Robert Hooke. I knew a lot about the early Royal Society, and I had the idea that wouldn't it be great to write a techno thriller, but using Robert Hooke and particularly his micrographia, his use of the microscope. I thought that would be a great kind of CSI 17th century London, and kind of set to work then. And the other thing, the kind of, I suppose that the most important text of my life that I've come across is Hooke's diary, and I read and reread Hooke's diary, used it extensively for my MA thesis, and went back through it to find incidents in there that I could use. It kind of grew out of different things like the pickpocket jumping from the balcony of the monument, for example. The Bloodless Boy himself is fictitious, but I wanted sort of various different events, and look carefully at the timeline and the dates from Hooke's diary. So it kind of made sense to use what I knew, but also, I'm particularly interested in 17th century science. I don't think I'm that suited to a modern day thriller, which is all, networks and technology and mobile phones and things. I like the whole business of messages being taken across London and burning letters and things, documents and just. I guess I just live in that world a little bit more.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things that are very attractive about that time, aren't there? When you are caught up in all of the TikTok and the Instagram and everything else that we're all immersed in now. But Hook is probably not a character that, or a real life person that a lot of people know a great deal about. So are there any kind of examples or incidents from his life that really, you're enthusiastic about, like letting people know about?
Well, I suppose the range of what he did and was able to do. So you can, like his apprentice, Harry, that I use as the other main character, who really becomes the main character in the book. They applied themselves to so many different things, whereas scientists specialize much more nowadays. In the early days of the Royal Society, they really wanted to kind of explore and catalogue everything. And Hook, as well as being a microscopist, which I've mentioned, he was a leading astronomer of the day. He was an architect as well, a mathematician. He was appointed as the chief surveyor after the fire of London. So he was practically minded. He made instruments. He improved instruments. So his kind of range is almost absurd, and it's great to be able to explore different aspects of Robert Hooke in each book, and the same with Harry, as well as having all his new philosophical knowledge. He was also an artist, and one of the few things that remain of Harry Hunt's life are drawings that he did for the Royal Society. For example, a two-headed puppy and an 8-foot Swiss hussar. These are the odd things that remain from a life. But they were lifelong friends as well. And you can see Harry's progress through the Royal Society in the different roles that he held. But really very little is known about Harry Hunt. So it's great because I can invent all sorts about Harry, whereas, as you say, Robert Hooke is pretty well documented. But there are always gaps. You can always kind of find things that are missing. His diary, for example, is very terse. The things that he published, he started so much, which he then left undone, and other people kind of jumped on and developed. He didn't really have the time to develop half of the ideas that he threw out.
Well, one word you just used there, we're talking about Harry, you used the word invent. And, my wife writes historical fiction. And one of the things that we're always talking about is, to what extent, if you're using real characters, which you are doing, to what extent do you feel the urge, or the obligation to stick true to their character? And how much license do you feel you have to fill in those gaps that you mentioned? How do you strike that balance?
It's tricky. The ethics of it are interesting if you're using real people. I've said before that these people live their lives, and the people I'm dealing with lived kind of 350 years ago. They had that life, and in the same way that a book is written and that might be made into a film, or a single is recorded and then someone comes along and does a cover version. the original is always there. So I kind of justify taking outrageous liberties with what people were doing. In that sense, you know, and you see all sorts of films, TV, and read all sorts of books where people insinuate fictional characters into real scenarios, and you know, Robert Harris, for example, with World War II, or counterfactual things such as you know, where he posits a Britain which has been invaded by Germany, and you know, it's a whole sort of alternative world. I don't go as far as that, but I feel that I've got a fair bit of license. As far as character, I do the research, so I do think that I stick pretty closely to the character. I mean, Hook's character changed over time. I think I suppose a lot of people know about his disputes with other scientists, especially Newton. But he was nowhere near as disputatious as Newton himself was. But he felt aggrieved quite often that he wasn't awarded the credit that he felt he was due. So there's a certain cantankerousness about Hook that you kind of have to stick with. Other characters, you know, Charles II, for example, there's all sorts of documentary evidence. I can't suddenly change his character, but what I can do, I can kind of perhaps emphasize his sort of secretive side, and have him doing stuff that never made it into the historical record because it was deemed as it was deemed to be too scandalous, or you know, the things should be kept quiet. The sort of meetings at the Royal Society. My third book, for example, starts with an anatomy session at the Royal Society, which ends. I won't give too much away, but it ends in a certain way. So immediately they say this must never go into philosophical transactions, you know. So I have sort of taken liberties, but it's a funny and interesting thing. I find it a kind of fertile space to be in, where you're. One example from the first book would be John Locke, having him in London. Whereas letters written by John Locke show clearly that he was in France. So I explain that by saying he's got somebody sending letters from France to try and cover up the fact that he's in London because he's there secretively. So you can kind of play around with these things, but I think character is set. Events, you know, I wanted to make something exciting and create some kind of extraordinary event that they have to respond to, which is fictional. So the two, you know, hopefully mesh together in a sort of satisfying way.
Yeah, because for example, in the Poison Machine, you mentioned one of the details that I thought really brought him to life was the way that you have Isaac Newton making all of these strange kind of guttural sounds. You know, when people interact with him, rather than talking, he makes these weird noises. Is that something that is realistic, or is that something that you came up with yourself?
It's I think his oddness is well documented. Again, you know, they've taken him by surprise in that scene, haven't they?
They have.
The public persona of Newton, certainly later on when he became president of the Royal Society, or you know, he was head of the Mint. You know, he like all of us, he had a public persona, and I'm sure he had a private persona. I think lots of people attest to his oddness. I think nowadays you would probably ascribe that to being on some kind of spectrum. But yeah, whether that's true or not, I don't know. But yeah, he's there for a reason in the book, isn't he? And his oddness. At the end, he just turns around, doesn't he, and stops talking to them. So yeah, it's kind of a little bit of imagination, but I think people attest to what is sort of strange, and again, what a secretive character he was. He was up to all sorts of things, which only came to light after his death, with his alchemy and so on. So quite odd religious beliefs that he had to keep to himself.
So what kind of research do you do in order to uncover this stuff? Because, you know, the depth of detail that you have is, I think, much more than most people. You know, most people would be aware of Isaac Newton. They would have heard of a lot of these other characters, but they wouldn't know, you know, these kind of defining characteristics. So what do you do to uncover all of this stuff?
There's a lot of stuff on Newton. Read biographies, I guess, is the straightforward answer to that. He's also appeared in a couple of fiction works, you know. So there are kind of fictional versions of Newton. You kind of make your own Isaac Newton, don't you? It's not got a huge role in the book, but it's quite an important one plot-wise, without giving too much away.
But that would be a great marketing tie-in, wouldn't it? And make your own Isaac Newton. You could have a little doll. You know?
Yes, yeah.
But you know, you've
cut out and keep.
You've got a fabulous range of characters, though. So from real history, how do you decide who to include? Is it due to the demands of the plot? Is it the people that you personally are interested in? How do you go about populating the novels?
It stems from the early fellows of the Royal Society. So it's Hook's world, it's Harry's world, the people that they knew. And then it's sort of odd things that come along. So the beginning of the writing of the Poison Machine all came from this one fact that I stumbled across while reading Nick Page's book about Captain Geoffrey Hudson, who was the Queen's dwarf. He was taken into Queen Henrietta Maria, the King Charles I's wife, taken into her court for his extreme smallness. He was across in Paris during the civil wars when the Queen was trying to drum up money for her husband's, you know, army for equipping the army, and he was captured straight. I'm sort of thinking, because I'm trying not to give too much away that's in the book, but he was captured just after that, and ended up being a slave of the Barbary pirates for 25 years. And when he came back, he was twice as tall, which he explained. To put it bluntly, he ascribed that to all the buggery he suffered as a slave of the Barbary pirates, which I don't really understand the physics of that. To me, a more attractive explanation was that actually this was a second taller dwarf. So slightly absurd. It amused me. And so Harry is kind of sent for to identify the remains of a dwarf. He finds out, you know, that Captain Geoffrey Hudson has been murdered, much to everyone's amazement, because actually someone else has been living as Captain Geoffrey Hudson, and not only that, he's been spying for the king, which you know, the real Geoffrey Hudson did.
Mm-hmm. And one thing that's often said about the power of historical fiction is that you can cast a really good spotlight on the present by observing things through the lens of the past. Is that something that you found to be true, or are you just interested in telling the story that you that had caught your fancy through your research?
I think people kind of interpret what you're. I mean, you know, when The Bloodless Boy came out, we were in the middle of COVID, and lots of people sort of saw that. It kind of gave it a kind of COVID-inflected sort of background, and which, you know, when I was writing it, I didn't have at all. What I was much more interested in was more about prejudice, and there was a lot of particularly anti-Muslim prejudice going on in politics at the time. I suppose I'm sort of I've become more aware, re-editing this book this year for Melville House. I mean, you probably know it was self-published originally. They picked up the two books that I'd self-published. I was more aware that people would interpret it, you know, in a particular way. And what we have as well as COVID is Brexit, and a slightly crazy, you know, we've got a new prime minister today. We've got a kind of crazy political situation here in the UK, which you know, the Times in London and in Paris, where Harry goes off to in the sort of middle third of the book. They were both going through these extraordinary events. We had the Popish plot in London, and we had the Affaire de Poisson in Paris, and so this kind of hysteria and disagreement fundamentally, how people should behave, should live. I find interesting. So I guess, you know, my historical fiction mirrors that in the current day. But you know, it's plot and character, and madness and mayhem ensues, and I think that comes first, and then the kind of parallels probably slot in second.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because there's that famous expression that the more things change, the more they stay the same. So, you know, do you find that rings true based on everything you read about from 350 years ago, or would you look at it and feel like it's just completely alien?
No, I think you look at things like COVID denial, for example, or science denial. You know, it was all there. It's exactly the same. All the different positions you can take on, you know, vaccination, for example, all the reasons that people take up their positions, the way that people decide what they are going to believe and then find evidence to buttress that, you know, afterwards. I find fascinating. All of that is there back in the late 1600s in London. You know, it's fertile ground, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Andrew, could I interject here and say I find that it's really interesting that Robert has picked the 17th century, because in truth, it's the orphan century in historical, certainly in historical crime fiction. Lots of medieval mystery, tons of Tudor and Elizabethan, a little 18th century, lots of Victorian, and we've moved into the 20th century. But for some reason, the 17th century has really been more of a romance province than it has been a crime province. There's, you know, romantic fiction about the English Civil War and so forth. And I went and dug out of my own library in 1997. Ian Pierce published a mega hit called An Instance of the Finger Post, and it was an enormous international bestseller. And it's set about a decade earlier than Robert's books. I think we're in can't remember exactly, but 1660 something or other. So we've had the Restoration, so there's more stability. We're past the war, and we have Charles on the throne, not doing his duty by having children. Well, he did. He had loads of children, but not legitimate children. But Ian also chose to write this about burgeoning science. And so I've wondered if the 17th century, particularly the late 17th century, once the war was passed and all, was such a rich time of scientific experiment. Is that maybe hasn't grabbed novelists as the stuff of thrillers, but in point of fact, Ian and now you have made it that. But it does demand, I think, a little more work of the reader. Would you say that's true, Andrew?
I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I thought it was a an excellent thing that these books take place in a time that it's like a vein that hasn't been mined as extensively as some other ones. So, one of the joys to me of reading historical fiction is that you learn as you're enjoying the stories and you're enjoying the characters. So I thought it was wonderful that the time period was what it was. And like you, Rob, I've got a fascination for the kind of early science, that I love the idea that we think we know certain things now, but we can look at what people were, how they came to these understandings, and the places where they were wrong as well. I remember, and how they blend into other parts of society, other prejudices, religious views. I love in your cast of characters, you have various Catholic prisoners for burning. You have just captured the sort of the zeitgeist perfectly, because I remember, is it Bertolt Brecht who wrote a play about Galileo, where they refer to the telescope as the devil's tube. If you even look into the devil's tube, then you're instantly damned. So the idea that there's this backdrop, you have a vivid execution scene fairly near the beginning, the idea of living in a time where believing the wrong thing, saying the wrong thing can have these dire consequences. It just is really, really vivid, I think. And I think it's a great time period to pick. So, one thing that I couldn't help thinking when I was reading it was, you've included so many wonderful characters and episodes and incidents. Are there any that you've found in your research that you really love, that really juicy or exciting, that you wanted to put in the book but just wouldn't fit? Was there anything in there that the extra that we need to know about?
The as well as the extraordinary kind of doubling in height of Captain Jeffrey Hudson, when I started, I knew that I wanted to have a fight in a library. I hadn't read any scenes where books are hurled and smashed into people's faces. I thought, wouldn't that be fun? So I ended up with the Bibliothèque Mazarin in Paris. There are various things. Book 2 includes things that didn't make it into book 1. Book 3. You come across all these different things while you're researching. Part of the reason that book 1 took me so long to write was that I kept trying to include everything, and I had to keep pruning stuff out. I mean, you asked me earlier about how I choose characters. I think it's basically a technique of shoving everybody in. And then when it comes to editing, realizing that actually you don't need 17 villains, you can probably trim those down a little bit. So it's the ones that kind of make the cut, and people, you end up combining people and sort of simplifying and perhaps oversimplifying. Sometimes you kind of regret some of the choices that you make, but you don't want to end up with a 300,000 word monster. It's got to thrill. And I think I was guilty of overstuffing the plum pudding with the first book, and I think some people think it is still too much of a plum pudding, perhaps. But
well, that's interesting, Robert. So you were more driven really by the background, the historical period when you started, than the characters. But have you found as you've been writing that the characters have come to life and in fact are more interesting to you now?
They are. I remember our conversation last year with Lee, saying that the relationship between Hook and Harry started to remind me of my relationship with my father, and that's when it became interesting. The characters then became characters rather than ciphers that you kind of push around from place to place, and they achieve certain objectives and go back and report and then go on to the next objective until they sort of finally solve the crime. That relationship between them became more and more interesting. yeah, you've got Harry's sort of burgeoning relationship with Grace, the kind of moonlighting thing of will they, won't they kind of thing. That sort of helps things along as well. But character takes over. All that careful plotting that you do. There are insurrections along the way which you have to kind of cope with, because the old soldier, Michael Fields, in the two books, he writes himself. He just takes over. I hear his voice, and he'll be chatting away about the civil wars for pages. And at the end of the day, I think, oh my God, I've done sort of 5,000 words of Michael Fields chatting. It's the one character who really does sort of speak up for himself, which is not spooky, but it's very welcome, because you can always get your word count.
Oh, so were there any other characters that you initially didn't think were going to be very major, but then somehow they just came to the fore and dominated in that way?
I knew, having finished book one, that Hortense Mancini deserved more space. I kind of fell in love with her a bit, and I haven't changed it. I haven't really exaggerated her very much at all. If you read her memoirs and all the kind of accounts of her, she was just that scandalous and fascinating. So she's a great character to follow on. With regret, I've left her behind in book three, but I keep sort of thinking, well, maybe Harry can go and pay Hortense a visit, but is not doing that. So she is a great character. Possibly deserves a spin-off, I think.
I think so too. But would you say that most of this came from interests that you already had, or were you finding that you had to do research specifically for these books?
As I turned from a pantser to a planner. The book one took ages, because I just sort of let it go where it pleased. I was a lot more disciplined with book two. I've lost the gist of your question a little bit there, Andrew. Can you repeat it?
Yeah. So did these books come out of an interest that you already had, or did you find that you were having to very much focus your additional research in order to?
Yeah. So I think it's sort of chicken and egg, really. So you put a plot together, and you make notes to yourself. Must research this. Whether that's the uniforms of a particular, the first foot. In the first draft, you don't slow yourself down by what color were their socks. You'll find that out later. So the research kind of starts the thing. Knowing a fair bit about my subject kind of helps. When you're putting a sort of 20,000 word outline together, you make notes to yourself what sort of then go up and look up. I've got a reasonable library of books that I can go to, and books with indexes are very useful things. So you're constantly going to consult the books that you have to find out more stuff about certain people. Isaac Newton, you mentioned earlier. I've got a lot of material on Isaac Newton in all my various books. I can go and look that up fairly quickly. But in a first draft, it will be Isaac Newton acts oddly, and then you kind of move on.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And in terms of the research and in terms of the historical setting, one thing I'm kind of obsessed with is language. Is vocabulary. And one thing I was really impressed with was the way that you would select certain words that had a very authentic feel to them. For example, with Isaac Newton, you would talk about his elaboratory rather than laboratory, in the same way that you might have talked about a manufactory instead of a factory. Is that something that you just picked up as you went, or did you have to do specific work to make sure that the vocabulary was appropriate to the time period?
Well, the original version of the Bloodless Boy was full of 17th century isms, and in fact, I originally wrote it where I capitalized the first letters of nouns, and I wanted it to look like sort of similar to Peter Ackroyd's Hawksmoor. I wanted it to read like a 17th century document. I cut a lot of that out, partly because of advice from other people, including publishers who were originally interested, and they suggested that was kind of too much. I've read other books. Jazz Treadwell recently has done a fantastic book, which uses 17th century formatting style, and the font is it's as if you're reading a 17th century document. But I think that might get a bit too exhausting. So I didn't, in the first book, I included lots of 17th century documents. I had the old, again, sort of not giving too much away, but the old new philosopher, I guess, and all his documents that Harry's decoding, all the sort of 17th century language there. I find that it's probably more effective just to sort of put maybe one or two terms on a page to sort of hopefully throw people into that time or language. Word order sometimes, but it's not. I was very pedantic about it. I'm less so now. I've certainly relaxed it a little bit in book 2, but terms like e-laboratory, it's just richer, isn't it? This is a room where you elaborate, and it's a nice it's a nice thing. The first book was very medical, so there were lots of juicy 17th century medical terms that I could use, and I didn't really mind whether if I left people behind, that they're in a kind of particular context. It doesn't matter if you don't know what a particular word means. You can always look it up. Melville House, by the way, just to plug my publisher, the Kindle version is a thing of beauty where you can click on a word and it explains the 17th century word that you've come across if you're confused by it.
Excellent. I just want to throw in, if any of our online audience would like to ask any questions, please do throw them into the chat so that we can relay them to Rob. But Rob, it's very interesting, in terms of the process, to hear things that you kind of changed as you were writing the first book, from the first book to the second book, in terms of changes to your process, becoming more of a planner. Is there anything else that you learned during that process that might help anybody who's watching who is in the same on the same side of the table?
Well, I had huge problems with the first book because I didn't have a clue how it was going to end, I kept changing my mind, and then one day. I think the one character that I hadn't had do it, I suddenly thought, it was him, and it suddenly made so much sense. So the second book and the third book, I started at the end, and then you can sort of think about your beginning, which kind of has to be an opposite state in that case, So you've very quickly got a beginning and an end, and then you can work out the middle as the roots between the two things. Having an ending, I think, is you've written so many books. Lee Child has written so many books. I'm sitting here telling people how they could write theirs, but the big thing for me. Which shouldn't have been a breakthrough at all, should it? But it was such a breakthrough. Is have your ending, and then it makes it so much easier to, structure your tent poles or the spine of the book, because everything's leading to that point. So for me, that was the big kind of Archimedes jumping out of the bath moment.
Excellent. All right, well, I want to ask you a question that goes in a completely different direction now. I noticed that you were originally a painter. So I really love photography myself, because I have absolutely no other kind of talent. And I've often thought about the similarities between composing a photograph and composing a narrative. And I was wondering, as a painter, do you see any similarities with between painting and writing?
I like to see them as being completely separate. Actually, I like the jump in sort of mental space from one to another. It's funny because through sixth form, I knew I wanted to do a fine art degree, but I wanted to be Britain's next great landscape painter. So I was busy doing big splatty, landscapes and chucking paint at surfaces, and it was all about richness of surface and texture of paint. And then I went to Coventry to do my fine art degree, and that was really a strong. The course had a fantastic art and language inspired, influenced teaching, and there were a couple of teachers there who got me on to Marcel Duchamp. And in fact, I'd started writing a novel with Duchamp as my main investigator at one point. One day I'll go back to that. So I moved from a splatty landscape painter to a video maker, a photographer, a performer. I made furniture, and everything was incredibly sort of pristine and finished and neat and tidy. So that 3 years was a sort of huge difference. And after that, I went on. I got really caught up with my BA thesis, which was all about time, because I was doing time-based work. I was interested in artists using time. So I took the subject time and got really into the science of it, the philosophy of it. And that is what led me onto my MA thesis, which was history of ideas. And then that led me to discovering Robert Hooke. So the kind of the change is, quite extreme. Writing, it also coincided with leaving teaching, which I left through exhaustion, really. I found that painting was incredibly therapeutic. To return to it was wonderful after so many years away. But I try and keep my painting sort of anti-intellectual. I like to copy things. I like to. My paintings are realistic. They're fussy. They're neat. They're detailed. They don't aim at photographic representation, but they're interested in or I'm interested in a degree of verisimilitude. So I get lost in trying to represent a scene, and that kind of flow of time is completely different experientially to trying to structure a novel or research or writing sentences. You get into a flow writing sentences, but it's different. It's a different sphere that I kind of go into. The Robert J Lloyd persona, is my writer persona. I think the painter's just roll with a paintbrush. He's somebody else, and I like the split between them.
I'm fascinated by the connection between all of those. And you mentioned about being consciously anti-intellectual when it comes to your painting. One of my favorite painters is L.S. Lowry, who painted scenes of the industrial landscape in the northwest of England. And one of his things, he refused to talk about the place where he went to paint as a studio or anything like that. He always insisted that it was his workshop, because You know, he was an artisan, he was a craftsman, you know, he was somebody that made things. And so it's interesting to hear you say the same, but, you know, I can completely see a connection between, you know, your books and the history of ideas, because, you know, you're bringing characters to life who were coming up with those ideas that we take for granted now. But what you're also doing is describing the landscape that they lived in, which is something that you can do also, you know, visually. So I think that's a tremendous kind of overlap. And one thing I was interested in was that you have obviously gone to great pains to bring London of its time to life, you know, Cambridge of its time to life, Paris, you know. So how difficult was it to do that? Did you go and visit the current day places and imagine what they would have been like? Did you do it from old maps? I mean, what goes into
I'm guilty of largely using maps for Paris. My trips to Paris are quite a while ago now, but luckily I had a very, very detailed the Turgot map of Paris, which is a panoramic map. And luckily it's available online. You can zoom in incredibly closely to the various buildings, and every building is represented. I took Harry to the Fens because I used to live there. I used to live in Cambridge, and then St Ives, just north of Cambridge. So I knew that part of the you know, that landscape well. And so I guess was able to describe that from my own experience of living there. London, yes, I've done those journeys. I've walked, you know, Harry's footsteps to time particular journeys and see, and I've also, you know, for example, the monument. I've chosen buildings that still exist. A lot of Hook's architecture has disappeared over the years through, you know, either lost during World War II or various fires and so on. But you know, the Bibliothèque Mazarin, for example, is still there. I deliberately sort of took Harry to places in Paris that are still around. You can visit. You know, if I become super famous, perhaps someone will organise a tour of these places. Geoffrey Hudson's cottage in Oakham in Rutland, for example, you know, it's still there. You can go and visit where my dwarf and his fictional imposter lived.
Well, that's tremendous. So we've got a question that's come in from one of our online audience, Eric Pratt. Says, when you say you get lost in describing a scene, what aspects or characteristics do you feel cause the most disorientation in writing out that scene?
I think I find it fascinating that the words on a page are just, it's scaffolding. It's a sort of sketchy framework that informs the person reading it. You know, when I read a book, I'm there, and you don't have to put that much on the page to transport somebody into that dreamlike state of being in a particular scene. And to know exactly what someone was seeing from your words, you know, wouldn't that be fantastic? And redrafting it, you know, you know yourself, you go over and over and over these same kind of setups, and you wonder how to do it better or more concisely. One thing, you know, I'm very keen on is a sentence that says what you want it to say as concisely as possible. You're very good at this. But you know, your style is different to mine. I let my sentences roll on a little bit more than you do, I venture to say. But if I'm reading, you know, Better Off Dead, for example, that there are 2-word sentences, and sometimes I got that, you know, that's quite shocking. You just kind of stab it in there. There's a wonderful description of a restaurant, and you say, you know, it had 12 tables, table, four chairs, and there's the waitress, and at the end of the paragraph, it's Jack Reacher in first person, and he said, I liked it, and it just sort of made me laugh out loud. This sort of short, stabby sentences, but in my mind, I can absolutely see that restaurant because I've dreamt it up, haven't I? So the idea of sort of conjuring these worlds, and each world is different for each reader. The idea that what you've done is just given a sort of a menu, hasn't it, to somebody's imagination, which is bonkers, isn't it, really? But what you've actually done by putting some words on a page. So it in editing, you hope that you haven't done it wrong. You hope that you haven't over described something. Because quite often you can just say, that there was a dead cat in the corner, and that's enough. You don't have to describe the cat, do you? That conjures up enough for the reader to put them into that. There's an atmosphere. So yeah, I hope that's answered Eric's question. It was a bit rambly, that answer, but I hope it's answered. It's a fascinating process, isn't it?
It is a fascinating process, and thank you for your kind words about Better Off Dead. And just a quick answer for Carl Gale. Yep, Carl, I will be back later, 7 o'clock. To talk about No Plan B with Barbara. So yeah, this is completely different. This is all about Rob, and I'd like to thank Polly Helms for her comment about saying that Rob, you're given a wonderful interview today. So thank you, Polly. Glad that you've enjoyed it. Any more questions from our online audience? Please let us know. We're starting to run a little short of time now. So Rob, I really just wanted to ask you a little bit about, you've mentioned the third book a couple of times. Oh, by the way, Eric says, yes, you did answer the question. Thank you very much. So thumbs up.
Cheers, Eric.
I just want to, you've teased us a couple of times mentioning the third book. I was wondering if there's anything more you can tell us about that.
I am so smug about the first chapter. I've come up with my sort of my best opening chapter, and now I'm struggling to kind of keep the rest of the book kind of up to there. He's got a so it's the first two books kind of ease their way in a little bit. This one starts with a bang. Back to Better Off Dead, by the way. What a shocking opening that is. You kind of go, oh, come on, can't possibly have happened. So I don't want to say too much about book 3, other than it's kind of a Harry ends up on the wrong side of the law. Let's leave it at that. But yeah. So I've got to get the thing finished because Melville House want to publish that one as well. So work to do.
That is excellent news. Yes, you do have to get on and finish it because we are all desperate to read it. So no hanging about. As soon as we're finished, straight back to work. One thing I always wondered, I was wondering about is I've so enjoyed the way that you've described this period 350 years ago. But what if you had to write about a different time period? Is there another one that would interest you, or is it always going to be about Harry and co?
Well, I mentioned earlier Marcel Duchamp, 1920s Paris. I've kind of thought about. I don't know. I have literally struggled with writing about another time. I was trying to put together a World War II story set in Germany to cater for GCSE students. I thought it would be a nice idea to kind of pitch a book at people doing their GCSE, which is Barbara. It's sort of 14 to 15-year-old that level. So everything on the curriculum, I would try and put in somebody growing up in Germany. And I was researching, and I probably wasn't at the right time, quite in the right frame of mind, but researching the horrors of World War II Germany really sort of affected me. I had to step away. I had to step away from it, and probably found solace and safety back in the 17th century. But you know, well, one day I would like to try you know, another time. But I think I probably would avoid the modern day with all its mobile phones and technology.
Yeah, I think there's always a fascination, isn't there? People who write in the past often wonder about the present. You know, I often wonder about what it would be like when you could set up all kinds of intrigues without knowing. Well, someone could just send a text and let everybody know. You know, so I think it's fascinating looking at that both ways. So, Barbara, have you got any more questions that you would like to throw in before we wrap everything up?
I'm having an unstable internet connection, which I have to figure out. So if I suddenly freeze, just disregard it. I was wondering, listening to Robert, how much you can remove the school teacher, the pedagogue, from you as a storyteller. Have you found that, you know, your years, because you spent 2 decades teaching, do you find that that's an asset or a handicap when you're writing historical fiction now?
Oh, I don't know. The books attempt to be thrillers. I'm not trying to educate, really. I'm trying to have fun while I'm putting these plots together, and you know, certainly the second book is quite absurd in some way. I try, you know, I took an idea and tried to stretch it and push it. It's bonkers, really, but great fun. You know, I find that very entertaining. I'm trying to entertain rather than educate. I'm sure that it does feed in somehow. I think all that planning that I did as a teacher, I taught special needs as well as secondary, so communication has always been important. You know, and trying to communicate clearly. I'm not as good at that as you're aware in an interview as on the page. I think it's a terrible thing that authors not only have to write books, but then they have to come on things like this and talk about it as well.
It's a different grading system, Robert, and you're just listening to it. That's the thing.
Yeah, but I think, you know, a desire for clarity is no bad thing. That probably comes from my teaching.
Well, I'm always interested that people, because, you know, come to writing from different careers. I mean, Andrew has been in telecommunications and marketing. You know, Lee was in the BBC. I was a librarian. I mean, I think there's no way that we can avoid bringing, you know, what we've learned or how we behaved or whatever from our other lives into where we are at the moment. So
yes, I mean, my CV is absurd. You know, I'm a cinema projectionist and network solutions, you know, sales, water purifiers, all sorts of. I was an architectural ironmonger. Yeah,
you strive for clarity and accuracy very much, and I think that may stem from your career as a teacher. You know, I mean, to really write good historical fiction, I think, believable if you're using real characters, you have to look for the gaps in what's known about those characters, because you can't mess around with what's really known. Or as you pointed out so well, you and Andrew, you can't really change their character. So, you know, what you can look for is places. Your wife, Tasha Alexander, I think, does that really well, Andrew. And we've talked about that, you know, that you look for those places where you can imagine things, but you can't completely traduce the character or the real facts. And I think, Robert, you're more scrupulous than, you know, I mean, you're very scrupulous, not more, in behaving that way. And I think that makes your novels actually very teachable. So you may end up having actually written texts that will be taught in school through fiction.
Yeah, you test each paragraph by saying, is this plausible? It might be absurd, but, you know, lots of absurdities happen every day. But is it plausible? And if it isn't, can I make it plausible? And that's
Right.
part of the fun of the process.
Well, that's true. You also have to remember to keep it entertaining. So you've got a dual thing going on there. It's really been a pleasure to see you again. We've run out of spare child brothers, so we're either going to have to repeat or we're going to have to go in a different direction. But we'll look forward to book 3. Andrew, you've done you're a wonderful interviewer. I'm trying to remember if we've actually done this together before.
I think we did it one time. Remember, I think we did it one time. There was a novel set in Sheffield that we talked about. There was a lot of fun. But,
Yeah, it's been wonderful. I'm sorry that this connection is frozen, so it's best if I leave. But anyway, thank you very much, Robert, and thank you, Andrew. I appreciate all of you who've joined in the discussion today. And here's my reading copy, but we have actual books.
There's my copy. Yes.
Right.
Okay.
So I urge you to do that. And The Bloodless Boy, there I go again. The Bloodless Boy is out in paperback, so you have a chance to buy that. In addition, you don't have to read it first, but I think it's a richer experience if you read The Bloodless Boy and then The Poison Machine, or I guess you could do it reverse, whichever. Anyway, thanks very much, guys. Bye.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, guys. It was a pleasure.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry.